Okay.
Hi, Mom.
Hi.
We're going to talk a little bit about what your earliest memory is, or how far back do you know of your family?
Okay. My great grandfather was George Busby, and I have a feeling he was a member of the Chartist movement because where he lived was a lot of charter bungalows, and and his house was the old schoolhouse, called the old schoolhouse. Originally, he had a school on the left-hand side and a chapel on the right-hand side. So it must have also been connected to the Methodist Church. Eventually, they built a new school down the hill from there, and a new chapel just down the bottom of their road, called
Okay.
the Upper Crescent.
And is this
And
this is your grandfather?
my great grandfather,
Great great grandfather?
yeah,
Wow. Okay.
yeah,
And so, what
and
do you know his name?
George.
George.
I
Okay.
don't know his wife's name.
What's the and it was Busby?
Busby
Busby.
is the
Okay.
Busby side of my family.
Okay.
And then my mum talked a lot about her grandfather, which is my great grandfather, and his name was John. And and then he was married to Amy, and her maiden name was Townsend, and they had 3 children. The oldest was my grandfather, John William, called Will, and the
Busby.
Busby. And then the second child was Lucy, and her married name was Godfrey. And the third one was Alfred, and I don't know who he was married to. But I do know he had a son, Nicholas, that used to work for BOAC. He was a pilot. Then my grandmother and grandfather had 10 children. The oldest was Stanley John, and he married Dinah Shore. Not Dinah Shore, Dinah Shire. Shire. And Dinah Shire. And he didn't have any children. The second one was Gordon James, and his wife was Gladys, and I don't know her maiden name. The third one was Wilfred, called Bill, and his wife was Mary, and I don't know her maiden name, but she was a big presence in my childhood because she did, we had a lot to do with her.
Oh, really? In what regard?
Well, she was a nurse originally, but she was a funny lady, and funny lady in a kooky lady in a nice way. And she was very good with children, and she'd give us Christmas presents, and she'd make us dresses. When you could get material after the war, she made us dresses. So she was a really nice lady. And but yeah, she was a nurse.
Oh, really?
An RN, yeah.
Did she work during the war then, or?
I presume she did. She must have done, because they had to work during the Second World War. If you had kids, or sometimes if you didn't, if you had kids and you still sometimes had to work, if you had a profession and that, then, people with kids worked as well. My mother had, at that point, at the beginning, she was 18 when she married my dad, and so she had 5 children in 8 years. And so she was
busy.
Yeah, but they didn't make her work because she had enough work. But they would you still have to have refugees and evacuees that you were made to take in. you had to take in, if they thought, they came and evaluated your house, and if they thought you had room, then you had to take somebody and make room for them. So what my grandmother did was send my 2 aunts to live with my mum next door, and then my grandmother had the evacuees.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. And my great-grandparents died at the great age of something like 83 and 85 or something.
Your great-grandparents did?
Yeah. They were, they died just before the war started in the 30s, yeah. Which was a great age for that time. And then...
a nice long life.
Yeah. And a good one, because at that point, the family farm was huge, but it got smaller because of, I don't know if Americans realize, but death duties in England, the taxes you pay after death are horrendous, even now, even these days. And so they had 2 different deaths, both brothers, both my great-grandfather John and his brother Charles died not in between, and they had death duties for both of them because they owned the farm between them, I think. And so the farm, to pay the death duties, they had to sell off the land, and so it ended up that the farm got, by the time my grandfather inherited it, it was more of a small holding than a farm.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So your family's been farmers for generations.
Yes, I think that was one reason. I don't know how my great-great-grandfather came down. I know he wasn't Oxfordshire born. I think he came from something like Lincolnshire or somewhere like that. Because what they did was, with these Charterville villages, was they moved people from up north in the factories and other places, and thought that if they gave them a house and an acre of land, or 2 acres of land, that they could make a living and have a good life. But it didn't really work out that way.
So you think that's how he came to the community?
Yeah,
then?
I think that's how the Busbys came down here.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what do you remember about your grandfather? I know you spoke about, he was a bee farmer and had...
No, that's my grandfather's house that was a bee
okay.
farmer.
All right.
Yeah. My grandfather Busby farmed. He still farmed. He still had, grew wheat and stuff in the field in front of the house. And he was a small man. He was smaller than my grandmother. She was considered local, because even in England, even though his family had come in, say, 1850, my grandfather would still have been considered by some people in the village as not being local. And he also lived above the A40, which means that it was not village. You weren't in the village, you were outside the village.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and but then those Charterville houses got, people moved into them that were local people, a lot of them, when the others, didn't make it. So it ended up to be a lot of local people living in it.
And then, so your grandfather married?
My grandmother was Margaret Ann Cross, and her family were village people. And my grandfather was John William Busby, and they had 10 children. And they, when they first got married, they lived in a charter bungalow next door to the big house, to the old schoolhouse. My great-grandparents lived in the old schoolhouse, as they call it. And
Okay. So what number child was Nana?
She was 7. She was a seventh child.
Oh, okay.
And Debbie was a 7th child, and so it's considered lucky to be the 7th child of a 7th child.
I guess so. It's a number of completion in the Bible.
Yeah. So, but yeah, she was the 7th. She had Stanley John was the oldest, and then it was Gordon James, and then Evelyn Nancy, and she had a 3rd name, but I thought it was Mary, but and then the next was Wilfred, Uncle Bill, and then the next one was Amy Lillian, and she was the 2nd daughter. And then the Uncle Ken was the youngest. Kenneth, I don't know what his 2nd name was. He was the youngest of the first 6 that Granny had, and then she waited about 7 years, and she had my mother, which was Alice Doreen, and then Sybil Margaret was next, and then Joan Lucy was 3rd, and Betty Joyce was the youngest. And she had Auntie Betty when she was 46.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Wow, that's remarkable.
And Auntie Betty used to get most upset because, and she, told me this more than once, because she was named for my granny didn't name her, the nurse named her, the nurse that delivered her named her. Midwife that delivered her named her, and that used to, it upset me. If my mother hadn't actually named me,
I'm sure that maybe circumstances led to
Yeah,
that situation.
I think my gran was ill. I know she was very ill when she was 46, and I don't know if it was after that, but she was. They thought she was going to die. My mum had to come. They took my mum and Auntie Sybil and Auntie Joan from school to say goodbye. So,
oh wow.
Yeah. So I don't know if it was connected to the birth or what. I have no idea.
How long did she go on to live for?
Till she was 81.
Oh, okay.
She died when I was 21.
Okay.
Just before your Aunt Jenny's wedding, actually.
Well, how did, so Nana, she had I know she was maybe a somewhat precocious child as far as stirring up trouble, and
she would, my grandpa was a small, skinny man, and my mother was like him. She was. In fact, she used to always looked younger than she was. And when she had my sister Mary, and she was 18 when she had my sister Mary, and she had to take her up to the doctors. The doctor kept telling her that they wanted to see her mother, the child's mother. They didn't want her sister to be there, and she couldn't get them to understand that it was her child, and that she was older than 14. That they thought she was 14. And then when we were kids, she could get on a bus, and they think you could go on a bus in England for, you had cheaper fares if you were under 14. And she used to get the cheaper fares, and she had about 4 kids by that time. So.
Goodness. Now we're okay, so what year did she and Grandpa marry? Do you know that year?
1935.
1935.
Yeah.
And then shortly thereafter
they had Mary. Yeah.
Okay.
Mary.
All right.
And then, yeah.
So how many children did she have by the time the war started?
She had Mary and Jenny before the war started. I was born in 1940, so I was a war baby. And then she had Michael and Richard. She had 5 children in something like 6 years or so.
the war ended in what year?
In 1945. I'm talking about the war in Europe ended in 1945. In 1946.
Oh, did it? Okay.
For the Japanese part of the war.
So did you see your father a lot of times
No.
during that time?
We did in the beginning. He used to come home and it was like blackouts. You were completely blacked out. You could not have any light showing. You couldn't have any light showing at all. You couldn't, like nothing, because they thought that the Germans, and they would have done if they'd have seen a light, they'd have bombed. So flashlights had to be so that you could barely see. You could just, so that they didn't know that's what it was. And then you had those, like I said, the blackouts. And we had, when I was a child, we had a night light, but it was, oil night light, oil lamp, and it was small. It was only about 4 inches high, but it was turned down low, just enough so you could see, my mum could see us in the bedroom.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of light they had. I mean, they didn't want you to have, oil was a premium anyway.
So do you have these memories of your own? Do you remember this time?
That me being in bed with Jenny and Mary, I remember that bed, and where the bedroom was my mum ended up living in the bungalow, the Charterville bungalow next to my grandmother's, where my grandmother lived originally. So my mum lived there during the war, and I remember that bedroom.
Were you aware of the gravity of the situation? Were you fearful?
I wasn't fearful so much. I think one of my really first clear memories was of sitting. It was a summer evening, and summer evenings in England are long, and looking over towards the leaf field on the hill. You could see on the next hill, and because we lived in the Cotswolds, and so and I can see boom, boom and dust and stuff somewhere.
Wow.
I didn't know where it was, and then my mother always said that you could, when they blitzed Coventry, so it was almost decimated. It was one of the worst bombings. You could see the fire from where we lived in Coventry was about 30-40 miles away. But you got to remember, there were no lights. There were no signposts in England, no lights anywhere. No, you couldn't, if you went down the street, you had to know where you would go. In the dark, you had to know where you were going. There was no
signposts, because they had them hidden from...
Well, because they thought it would help if the Germans actually arrived on in England. They would, if there were no signposts, they wouldn't know. And there were spies that ended up, coming and parachuting into England, and they'd find parachutes sometimes, and somebody, they caught them, but probably not always. And then, there was no railroad stations, didn't have where you were, like it didn't say Whitney and Oxford and whatever. You didn't know what station you were in, actually.
Goodness. So if you were not from that area, you would be hard pressed to get around.
Yeah, not even in London.
Yeah.
They didn't have, you didn't know whether you got to Victoria Station or not.
Huh.
And then there was what they called air raid wardens, and they would go around and, they had an initial for them. Well, I can't remember what it was, and they would go around and see if there was any light showing. They'd cycle around all night, seeing if there was any light showing or anything.
Yeah. Okay. And so, so you were on rations in your country
Yes.
for years afterwards, right?
Up until 1964 was when it was completely off ration. 1954. People in the States think that as soon as the war was over, the rationing was over. Well, it wasn't.
Not for Europe.
Not for Europe, no, because they had to build the infrastructure, for one thing, in factories, and they had to retool factories and build the infrastructure up. And they also had to make exports to export to get money, because they didn't have the money to rebuild like France and Germany did, because the Marshall Plan, because we didn't have boots on the ground in England, the Marshall Plan wasn't for us. So we didn't get any money after the war to help.
Gosh, and your whole country was,
Yeah.
upended.
I mean, there were still bomb buildings in 1960 in London, in Hastings, and places like that.
Goodness. So, do you have any happy times during the war? Were you happy?
Yeah.
How often did your dad come home?
My dad came home when he could, and sometimes he would if he couldn't get back, and it was a problem to get back, because most people, if you were going back, soldiers were going back, they'd stop and pick them up and take them to the next place. But a couple of times he was absent without leave because he couldn't get back in time. He wanted to come and see, my mum and the kids. And in the beginning of the war, we saw him a lot, but once after D-Day, we didn't see him for 2 years.
Wow, 2 years.
Michael didn't know him. Michael slept with my mother, and he didn't like it, because when my dad came home, my dad was in his bed. And he was 2 when it was, when they came.
Well, that was an adjustment for the whole family, I'm sure, having Dad back around.
My dad did leave, and it was sad, I hate reading it, with a letter that my dad left to Michael, when he was 2, when he left, and telling him to be the man of the family, and that if something happened to him, and a lot of other stuff.
So tell us about your dad's position in the war, responsibilities and job.
My dad was originally in the Coldstream Guards, so because he was in the Coldstream Guards, they called him up at the beginning of before the war even started, when they knew that there was going to be war. And he went into the Coldstream Guards again, and he was in the 6th Guards Tank Division at D-Day. But before that, he was a dispatch rider and drove officers around, and did a lot of other things and then he was a tank commander, Churchill tank commander from D-Day, until they didn't go in the first wave, because they had to fight past the Germans. But I don't know how many days afterwards, but he was there, and he said about going over fields and barbed wire and all that kind of thing. And he had, I think, about 3 tanks blown up under him. But funnily enough, all through the war, all he got was a shrapnel wound on his leg. He told of, in the winter, when they found some white paint in a barn somewhere in France, and they painted their tanks white so that they wouldn't show up in the snow. And, he was at the liberation of Holland twice, because Holland was liberated and then the Germans overran it again, and 9 months later, it was liberated again. And then he was at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen as well. And
Which was a
concentration camp. Yeah, he said that it was like, like they said, bodies stacked up with firewood, and they had to go and get the the townspeople declared they didn't know what it was, but they had to know because of the smell and stuff. And, from the ovens, and they had to go and get them to dig a hole to bury the people that they'd stacked in some of these sheds and stuff.
Had to get Grandpa?
No, they had to get German people. The next village,
okay.
The village, the towns and
and
villages around where Bergen-Belsen was, they had to
Wow.
do that. And he met the woman that was known for making lamps out of skin, especially if it had a tattoo or something on it.
He
Who
said, was this?
She was a member of Bergen-Belsen, the
Staff or whatever.
Yeah, and she was known for this, and he said he'd never seen such cold eyes. He met her, and he said he'd never seen such cold eyes in his life.
Do you remember her name?
No, I don't. He didn't actually say who she was.
So
And
they arrested her.
Yeah. And he used to have nightmares, and he'd roll up in a blanket and end up underneath my mum's bed, because I presume that's what he did in the tank if it was bombed. They were, and after that he spent a lot of time in our childhood in the shed mending shoes and stuff like that. But I think it was that, if somehow, children are noisy, and I guess sometimes the noise, got to him, like, we'd be playing and stuff. And he had spent a lot of time in that shed, and I think it was, now when I think back, I think it was PTSD that he had, because he was in, from the beginning. So, and he didn't get out. He didn't get out until 1946. He was in, they couldn't let everybody go at once, and so he was one of the people that he ended up being, he stayed in, and he was liaisoned with the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry in Cowley, Oxford for about a year, because my mum and I used to go up and see him.
So do you remember when the war ended? Was it a huge celebration for you? Or
I don't remember hearing that the war was over, but I do remember the party that we had, and somehow we had, red, white, and blue banners and stuff like that. I don't know if they made them or what, but I can remember the hall was decorated. And we had some kind of a meal or something there. So yeah, that was VE Day, I think, or just after probably.
So after the war, Grandpa, he repaired shoes. Did he have any other jobs?
Repaired shoes, and he earned $30 shillings a week, which is, I don't know what the equivalent would be in dollars. And he cycled 14 miles to Oxford and back for that job, and he had to keep then when he was working there, he had 5 kids. And then in 1948 we had Nick, and it was still hard. It was still difficult after the war. There was still rationing, still sugar was on ration. There was a lot of clothes were still on ration for a while. And for a long time, and I think the first time that my mum actually went and she bought Jenny and I dresses alike, was when I was 16, and she went to Swindon into a store and was able to buy us a dress each, because I guess ration had gone off by then. But money was tight. Money was tight the whole time. I mean, I wore jumbo sale clothes for years. Not when I went to the grammar school, but when I went to elementary school, I did. And hand-me-downs from my sister, because I was the third oldest. So yeah, and shoes. I remember a pair of shoes that my mum got me at a jumbo sale to go to school, and they were bright green shoes with red wedge heels. And I thought they were awful. I felt so ashamed in those shoes because they weren't like the shoes that other kids had. Nowadays it would be okay, but then it wasn't. But,
to be okay to be different from other children?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know about that.
But well, I mean, I'm just saying that, that really stood out. Nowadays it wouldn't stand out, then it did. And then also, they used to buy old cardigans, my gran and my mum and them, because they needed wool for uniforms, so you couldn't buy yarn. And so they would buy sweaters and stuff, and they would unpick the yarn and reuse it to make, say, a kid's cardigan or something. Or they take a grown-up's clothes and they'd remake it for kids, or even grown-ups. They'd or turn it or unpick it and turn it and sew it inside out, and
all sorts of creative.
Yeah, I mean, they got really, really creative, both cooking was, they used everything with the kitchen sink to make pies and stuff like that. Squash and stuff instead of apple, a lot of different stuff. If you get on the internet, you can find all these war recipes. And one of the things that saved us, and people, when I say I like Spam, people are amazed, but Spam saved England in a lot of ways, because it wasn't on the ration books. The Americans sent it, and you had to, line up to get it, but you could feed. My mum could get like 6 pieces in a can of Spam, 6 to 8 pieces, and that meant that we all got a piece of meat, and you could use it, I don't know how many different ways with eggs. You could have it for breakfast, lunch, dinner. You could have it, cook it in a casserole, cook it in anything. It was so versatile and even after the war, it was still a cheap meal for us.
Maybe that's why we ate a lot of Spam growing up.
Yeah, because I still cook it today. I still love it because I just think that
it saved you guys, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times you wouldn't have had meat if it hadn't been for Spam.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah. Well, tell us about, how old were you when you started to go to school?
I was 4. 3 or 4.
Wow, early then.
Yeah, because, even though my mum wasn't, didn't have to work, she still had to do stuff, for the war effort and stuff like that. You still had, you couldn't buy ready-made clothes, so you had to sew them yourself. And if you got, 4 kids or so,
wow.
It was.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then I was 4. It was a way of putting kids in school so their parents could work. And so I went to school at first 4. And then, and I'm not talking about, it wasn't a half day. You went to school about 8 o'clock and you didn't come home till about 4.
So what sorts of lessons did you have?
I actually, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but I actually learned to sew in elementary school to hem, and I still hem that way today. Mrs. Little was my teacher, and she taught us how to hem. I can see it now, how to hem something.
Was that just the girls, or did the boys learn how to hem?
No,
as well?
just the girls. Some men, people don't realize knitting started with men, with sailors, knitting for their jumpers. And like in Ireland, in some places, it was how the sweater was knitted, that if somebody drowned, they'd know who it was. And so men, if you were on a ship, they did embroidery, men did, and also knitting. Because my grandfather did embroidery when he was on ships, and so he did embroidery.
Did you ever see any of his embroidery?
No, but I've heard my mom and my Aunt Grace talk about it. You know, I didn't get it. We didn't get any of it, but yeah. But you know, so I learned to knit early. Well, it was either that or my mother didn't buy us couldn't afford to buy us any toys, so we made our toys. We made our toys, you know, like Conker furniture.
Conker? What's Conker furniture?
Well, Conker's a horse chestnut, and what we would do was we'd take say if you wanted to make a chair, you take a Conker, especially if it was flat, it's flat on one side, and then you'd stick 4 pins for the straight pins for the legs, and then do like a back with like say 4 pins at the back and weave leftover yarn in the back to make it. And then if you made a table, then you'd stick them together with 2 straight pins, 2 of them, and then you do 4 legs, we just made doll furniture like that. You know, and settees and all that kind of thing. I mean, we did everything.
So, so you got through school. Did you attend the same schoolhouse throughout your school, or did you transition to other
I
schools?
went to school, to the local school. Well, we moved to Stanton Harcourt for 2 years so that we could get council housing, which would be state housing, from 1946 to April 1948. We were there, we were on a camp in a Nissen hut on an old army camp. And then, but I went to elementary school from primary school, they call it in England, from then till 11. And then at 11, you had the 11 plus exam to see whether you went to a comprehensive school, which was just a general school, or a grammar school, which you went to if they thought that you know, it was a higher class learning, like you got French and German, and I learned Latin and geography. So it was a better class school than the comprehensive school. The comprehensive school was mostly for people that were going to be just regular people.
Were you a good student?
No.
You were. You say that emphatically.
Because I think if I was interested in something, I was a good student. I if like English and history, I loved it, but I was good at regular arithmetic, but when it got to be algebra and trigonometry and all that, and even though I had 4 years of 4 years of French and 3 of German and 1 of Latin, French I can actually read somewhat, but German and Latin just, I didn't use it, so I can't remember what it was. But no, I was deaf in one ear for one thing, and for another thing I had a little bit ADD, and so that's what they'd say now. Then it was just that I daydreamed.
So what was your favorite subject?
History.
I could see that about you.
And English, because I like reading, and
you're a tremendous reader.
And I had a very good teacher at high school, Mr. Ford. He taught both of them, and he was a brilliant teacher, and so I think he really made it fun. And whereas some of the others were typical class, they were older and they were rigid in a lot of ways, some of them. And he wasn't, but some of the other teachers were, and it's not a good way to teach kids when you're really rigid.
It is difficult for the student, for sure.
But I had home ec. Mrs. Causer was home ec, and she was a really, really good teacher, good home ec teacher. And then Miss Isabel, no, I forgot what her name. Anyway, my art, she taught art, one of the teachers, she taught art and sewing, and she was good. She taught me to sew that, I didn't catch on right away, but later after I had you, Susie, I could figured out how to do it and to follow a pattern, and it was, the basic was what she taught me. And I was no good at art. I'm no good at art now. You wouldn't know my cat from my dog from my anything.
I think that you're good at art, but your creativity is through your needlework and your knitting and all of the crafts that
I can make up patterns for anything, for a lot of things. Sewing and that. If I didn't have a pattern, I could make it up, and I wanted to do it. But if it's done, when people say you have to do this, that, and the other, I'm not very good at that. I'm very good at just figuring out my own way.
What year did you leave school?
15 and a half, and then I went to work.
What year was that? In
1956.
1956.
April 1956.
Okay. So did you have aspirations to continue your education?
No.
Or what did you think your
That's
future
why
would be?
That's why I left school, because at that point my mother, money was still tight, and I knew I wasn't. If you wanted to carry on at school, you were either going to go to college or technical school, and I wasn't going to do that, and so I just didn't figure it was worth staying on at school. That was the legal, 15 was the legal age to leave school. And so I went to work at Woolworths on the sweet counter. And then I worked there for about a year and a half. And then I went to work for Smith Industries, which they were a car company, a company that made car parts, like transmissions and dashboards and stuff. In fact, they made it for Morris cars and Ford cars, and MG was one of the cars that they made some of the parts for. Okay. So, and I liked that.
What did you do there? What was your job?
I was a dressograph operator. They don't have them now because of computers, but at that point, I was in the office, and every piece of, every piece in the factory had to have a piece of paper with it, with what it was and all this kind of, a lot of information on it. And so what we would do would make, the dressograph operator would take a blank metal, piece of blank metal, and they would put, you have this machine, and it had numbers and letters and stuff like that on it, and you made out these forms, and then they would have a machine that would print them. It was like a form of printing.
Was it into metal? So were they making?
No, the piece that what they do was then they would blacken the back of the piece of the metal and print it. It would end up printing all these pieces of paper that they needed for the factory work.
Oh, okay. Because
you're talking about 1955. There's no computers or anything, so everything had to have. Yeah.
So who was your best friend during that time? A workmate or a girlfriend?
Well,
or...
my best friend from the time I was a baby was Leslie Little, now Haynes, and we've been friends for 82 years. And another one was Sheila King, who she went to the comprehensive school. She didn't go to the grammar school. Leslie went to the grammar school with me. That was another friend. And then my mother's cousin daughter lived next door, and we were friends.
What's her name?
Barbara Jones, and now she's Barbara Ford, but yeah. And
your cousin Christine.
And my cousin Christine, of course, because we were same age cousins, and we ended up. I used to spend a lot of time with her and her mother, and all through from when I was old enough to get on the bus and go up to Headington. She lived outside Oxford in Headington, and I'd get on the bus and go to Headington, change buses and get up to Auntie Amy's.
I'm sure that was a big deal.
It was scary the first time I did it, and because you had to ask people, and I, believe it or not, I was shy. And you had to ask people for directions, and I wasn't very good at it. But I mean, I had to be 11 or 12 when I did that, 11. And about Monroe's age, actually. And, we were friends. We've been friends all our lives. And then, I had lots of cousins and second cousins and, third cousins. In fact, everybody in the village. You had to be careful if you came newly into Minster, Lovell. You had to be careful what you said, because most of the people in the village were related in some way or another. They
lived together for generations.
Yeah, and so it was intermarriage and marriage to like second cousins and third cousins. Twice removed and all that kind of thing. I mean, they didn't marry cousins. The closest was my cousin Judy, and she married my grandmother's. She was my grandmother's granddaughter, and she married my grandmother's sister's grandson. So that's the closest I ever heard of anybody married. It was that type. Well, it's like small town America, I presume.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Everybody knew, and you didn't, because you didn't. The farthest place anybody got was probably Oxford, and occasionally people went to London, but not very often. And I think I was 15 when I went to London for the first time on a bus trip. Because it was 16, because I went with Jenny, and it was when I worked at Smith's. We went on a bus trip, but I was 16.
And Jenny's your sister?
Yeah, Jenny's my sister.
So what did you go to London for?
Because Smith's was a London firm, they were having some kind of competition or something. And they got up, like you do bus trips, even, in America they did that. Bus trips and so the Smith got up a bus trip, and it was outside. It wasn't in London City, it was outside London, one of the places outside London that we went. And they looked at us in amazement, because there we were, all these country kids with this Oxfordshire accent amongst Londoners.
I'm sure it was an adventure.
It's like a Southerner going to New York. And they look at you. That was the first time. And then we did go on day trips to the coast. Our Methodist chapel would have, once a year, we'd have a day trip to the coast for one. You go down, get up early in the morning and go down and get there about 10 o'clock, and then start for home about 5.
How did you get there?
A bus coach.
So how
You know,
how long did it take you to get down there?
Probably about 2 hours, 2 or 3 hours. And then you'd stop on the way. You'd have take sandwiches to eat for lunch, and then we'd stop on the way back and have fish and chips.
Oh, that was a big deal, I'm sure.
Yeah, because if you didn't do that, it's not as if we ate out all the time, because we didn't. I mean, we never ate out, and so it was it once a year. It was a big thing for us to go on that coach trip.
I bet.
And we went to a lot of different places, a lot of different coastal cities. Porthcawl in Wales, and Brighton, and a lot of other places, seaside places. I think we went to Portsmouth once, but I didn't like Portsmouth because it was their beach is pebbles.
I remember that going as a child. It was a shock.
So we didn't like that.
Yeah. So I know as far as eating in your community, eating out in your community, now the pub, I'm sure, was a central social spot. So what pubs did you have in your community?
Well, funnily enough, both the pubs in Minster, Lovell, one was pubs in those days did not have food like they do today. They have more of a advanced menu today. Then it was just pickled eggs and pickled onions and sandwiches and stuff you could get when I was growing up. Because for one thing, you couldn't get the food and stuff. And women did not go in the bar with men. You had what they called a snug, and women went in that side. Well, my Uncle Jim ran one pub, which was the White Hart, and called the Pike because it was a place where when originally they went from London to Bristol, it was a stopping place, and so it had rooms above it was a turnpike as well, where they had to pay to go through, but it was also a place to stop your carriage or whatever it is if you were going to Bristol. And they had rooms upstairs and all that kind of thing.
So the pub was how old? So it must have been hundreds of years old?
I think the pub's old. The White Hart was on the main A40 road, and the main A40 road's an old road, really old road. In fact, it follows one of the Roman roads, and to the coast. And it has to be at least 1700s. 16 or 1700s at least, I would say.
So that was the White Hart. Is there another pub in town?
And then the New Inn was another one, and that did the same thing, but it was only from I think it was made probably late 1800s. It was a lot later. In fact, both pubs were run by one was run by my grandmother. The New Inn was run by my grandmother's sister Frances and her husband Nobby, or Fred as his name was, but he was called Nobby all the time. And the second one was run by my Uncle Jim, her youngest brother, Jim Cross. They were both Crosses. They were both my grandmother's siblings. And Uncle Jim was her youngest brother, and he ran it with my Aunt Gert, and he ran it for 50 years.
Wow.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that pub. I know he had to run it during the war, but he ran it for about 50 years. So they both ran it, and then down in the village was the old Swan Hotel, and that was even older. That was one of the oldest hotels in England. That one is.
Goodness.
The Swan Hotel.
So it brought a lot of travelers or strangers to your community, I guess.
Yeah, one of our prime ministers spent his honeymoon at the Swan.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then Tony Blair's foreign minister was Jack Straw, and he bought the house that my grandmother was born in.
Interesting. Awesome.
What they did was they bought more than one house, and they made it into a bigger house. But yeah, in the old village, there's two villages. There's one below the A40, which is the original village, that goes back to the Doomsday Book and even farther than that, actually. And the top one was the Charterville allotments that they did in like 1850. So they were really two distinct villages, actually.
Interesting.
Because there was a lot of land between them.
All right, Mom. Thank you. I think that's enough for this time. Thanks for sharing.
Okay.